My drying life starting. Please get your pegs ready.
Architecture. I live in an elevated timber Queenslander cottage and the space under the house is all open. It's got battens around the edges and pretty much the whole space under the house has galv wire lines strung up. It's extremely well ventilated, but it's also lockable. And so I don't need to use pegs because there's no high wind under there.
When we did the renovation for the house, I designed the laundry with some consideration. That included a space, a 2-level rack for hanging, where you can hang up clothes that are wet, in the laundry.
Of course Queensland gets a lot of rain and so we often have to hang things underneath the house. We set up a washing line under the house, but the underneath part of the house had 2 problems. It was too short to really stand, you could stand up in it, but if you weren't careful there were a couple of beams you'd whack your head on. And it was also dirt under the house. So if you dropped something, it was curtains, it had to go back in the wash. Queensland.
I guess we just improvised wherever we were. So in rented houses around Brisbane, if they didn't have a washing line in the backyard, Wednesday string up a rope between a couple of trees or something like that.
So, the backyards that do have the barren lawn, dry lawn with the hills hoist in the middle. Everyone just sits around on deck chairs. There's drinking, and there's music, and then someone will put up the goon sack from the sack of wine and spin it around. Aesthetics.
I particularly like the effect of the long, traditional line in the wind. I particularly like the sheets on it, like it sails and moves in a big way.
Where people scratch their head with me, is that all the pegs have to match with every garment. And everything, or the corners have to be straight.
I try and get enjoyment out of it. And the ways that I do that are by, either aestheticizing it, or sort of rationalizing how it can be done in an efficient way. Or both. I don't like the form of the hills hoist, the way it dominates the landscape of the backyard. I don't really like the way it's become a cliché of Australian suburbia. And I think that the old-fashioned way of setting lines, those long lines, with props, is much nicer cause you can remove them. You just take the line down, take the props away.
Atmosphere.
We would always hang out on the hills hoist unless the weather looks threatening, although I tend to have a view that the weather looks more threatening more often than my partner.
I love the smell of sunshine in my washing. I change my sheets every week. And I just love getting into a bed that's filled with sunshine, it makes such a difference. And the towels, When you go to dry yourself with a towel and you can smell the sunshine. I love that.
I think there is an association of night damp making things smell as well. I think that's the kind of danger is that re-wetting. That brings out the smell maybe.
I often find myself hanging things out at night, which is fine, because we've got a light under our house. It's quite nice to do it. It's peaceful being out in the night. I do think hanging your clothes in the sun is just healthy. Technology. My mum was sick when I was young. That left my 3 brothers and myself, and I took on. We were fairly traditional. I took on the female roles. I was probably about 11 to 12. I remember I was young enough to have to stand on my tippy toes to put the clothes on the line, because I couldn't quite reach. I do have a clothes horse as well, especially for rainy or very humid days, so I do that as well. Just because I know how to do the washing well, doesn't mean I should always do it. It's totally disordered. It's quite interesting that the upstairs is relatively tidy and relatively clean, but downstairs is our big jumble. And often, the clothes are hanging above camping gear and children's bikes and carpentry equipment. It's a bit of a mess down there.
Well, if you're hanging out on the hills hoist, you always put the sheets and the larger things on the outside, and you put the smalls on the inside. You try to use up one bay before you move on to the next bay. Sometimes I do fold into the basket, like handkerchiefs and that kind of thing. Sometimes I fold things straight away and put them away, to bypass the ironing stage. Because I regard the ironing as unnecessary for things like my handkerchiefs and so on.
Memory. We heard the story of Jerry when we first moved into the house. Because he'd lived there until he passed away. It'd be sort of 15 or so pegs, just random pegs. And I've got them all kind of together on one line, one strand of the hills hoist. It's kind of a memento, because we've completely changed everything else inside the house. So it's really the remaining memory of him.
I've got a goddaughter, the first child in our group of friends. And we rigged her up to a hills hoist and spun it around when she was a baby.
I had breast cancer many years ago, and I couldn't hang the washing out. And I nearly went insane. So, my mum came down to help us out, and I used to follow mum out to chat with her while she put the washing on the line.
I was taught by my father. And this is because when I was a teenager my mother became seriously ill and subsequently died. And my father trained my sister and I in various household tasks. So, from the time I was 14, my sister was 12, we did a lot of housework. And he himself would do washing of his own, which is unusual for men born in 1927, probably.
My mum was born in 1916 and did everything the old-fashioned way. So, washing in particular, and ironing, was very specific. She had very specific routines. Do you know, I just don't think anyone would actually humanly do it in 2014. Place. That's the strangest thing, coming from South Africa, seeing the hills hoist right in the middle, that's sort of the feature of the backyard. It never had a washing line like this, ever in South Africa.
So sitting in a chair, looking out at the load you've just hung, while listening to the machine going in the background, makes a nice sound. I quite like that.
I had a friend pass away, 2 years ago, from breast cancer. I went out there and pretty much, sort of, howled at the moon, under the clothesline, just sat out there. Because that was I don't know why I went there, that's where I went and just sort of sat there and cried and howled at the moon. I grew up in Broken Hill and getting full sun in summer on clothing was not such a good idea because it would fade things. So, I am not fanatical about having sunshine on my clothes. It does get some sun which is fine, but I don't chase the sun.